All right, so let's get started. We're starting off just like we started at the very beginning with just an empty main.ts file. Everything else is just as it was installed. And I still have here the task.json file, which we may or may not use. We'll just leave that there for now. So in our main.ts file, I'm going to start off with just a little snippet that I created just for the initial start. And this is pretty much a very common start block of code. We're including Bootstrap to be able to load our initial component, at least the function for it. We're including component, of course, because we need it for our components, and on init to use the initialize function in case we want to run something when one of these components gets initialized. Cool. So let's start off. This loads. So let's put on here the template to make sure that this is loading, an h1 tag. And put here task list application. Save that. Switch over to our HTML. There we are. And we can see all of it right here, which is great. So we know that our initial component is loading. So let's go back to our code here. And let's start off. So we'll build this application with different component pieces on top of each other. And so we have a task list application. As we showed earlier in the first few slides, we'll most likely create a task list component and a task new component and such. So I know I added here task list application, but it seems kind of odd. And usually in the initial component, you don't really put data about the app. You usually just put your first component inside of the initial component. So let's do that first. And this will make sense as I type this out. So I'm going to create an Angular component here. I'm going to call this the tasks component. I'm going to give it a class of, a class of tasks component to follow the naming convention there. Let's save that. And let's just take this piece right here and put it in this component. And now this task component, let's include it in our initial component. So we don't have to really mess with task-specific data in our initial component. So here, all we're going to put here is the tasks directive here, the component. Let's put here directives. And let's put on here the, task component. There we are. Let's save it. And we should have the exact same thing. I just moved everything over to a new component. Let's switch over. Everything's working, and that's great. Let's also keep up inspect element. Otherwise, we're not doing really anything, right? We should always have inspect element up. Awesome. So we have our tasks component here. Let's add another component. Put here Angular, and let's add a component that's specific to the list of the tasks. So we'll call it a task-list, and the class name will be task list component. There's the naming convention. And there we are. I'll even add a little bit of spacing here with these things, just so it visually looks easier to kind of separate out each of the components away from each other. Let's add another one right here on the top of that. So we have the task list component here. Let's add some HTML to it, for tag, and put here task list. Save that. And let's include that task list in our task list application component. As we know, the directive, so we need the directives array here, task list component inside of it. And if we want to include it in this, of course, beyond that, we need to include the tag, the selector, which is task list. There we are. Save that. So now let's make sure that in place of the task list, we will see a H4 tag that says task list. Take a look. There is a task application, and there is a task list. That's great. So we have that component there. Now we have a task list, but we don't actually have a list of tasks. So I would say the next thing we should do is create a service provider that keeps a hold of all our tasks. So then we can use that service provider in our task list and list out all the tasks that we have. So let's create a service provider. And again, we need here the injectable decorator. So let's do that here, injectable. And then right afterwards, let's put the export class of task service. And in the task service, we'll say tasks is going to be just a a variable. That's fine. We'll leave it that as such. We will create a construct function here. So we'll put here constructor, because we'll probably use it later. But irrelevant of it, what I want to do as soon as this task service is created, I want that tasks variable there to be set to an array of tasks. And let's be a little more descriptive, I guess, of these tasks here. So let's create these tasks to be all objects. They'll have a title of first task, or perhaps, yeah, first task is good. And completed is going to be a Boolean of false immediately when I first created. And that's it. Let's keep it as simple as that. So let's put a couple other ones there. And I'm putting them immediately as the false value. So I'm just essentially just creating the array right there. We can make it even more elegant, but that's okay. We're trying to keep it very simple and constructive in a sense for you to kind of see it and understand it more so than make this fancy. So we have our task service. It's going to expect to have a tasks variable. We didn't specify the type. It's optional. And when this task service gets constructed, we'll change this tasks variable to be an array of tasks, which will have it pretty immediately as soon as the task service loads. Now, we want this data to be available to us in a task list. So since the task service is a provider, let's include that provider in this component. And another thing to keep in mind of, we're going to need this provider not only in this component, but in other components as well. So what we could do is we can include this task service provider all the way to our main component, our initial component, and all the components that are connected to it will take in and have available that provider. So we can put here providers and put task service for that provider. And now everything, the tasks object here and everything inside of it, such as the task list, will all have access to the task service provider. Now within each one, we still need to use the dependency injection, but it's just easier that way. We don't have to keep giving all these components their own providers for the task service. So here is the task list that we need to be able to access the task service. So here we'll say public task service type task service. Here we are. And inside of the task list, let's create an unordered list again. We've seen this already before in some of the demos, which is nice because you'll see it again. Sometimes seeing this a couple times helps. So here's this list item. Well, first off, what we can do is we can test this, right? We don't want to skip too many steps here. So before I fill in the unordered list, let's go next line over here, use interpolation, and say, let's call on a task service. And let's call on the tasks variable, the key. And let's also see it in JSON format to see if these tasks come up. Take a look, and there they are. It's an array of all of those objects. This is so nice to just kind of see it and troubleshoot it in the moment. So we know they're coming up. We know we have the data. We never have to really have to worry about going back to the task service to find out what's going on. We know that's working fine. That's kind of the nice thing of checking on this as you go. You don't want to write too much code and then have to go back 4 or 5 steps to figure out what's not working. So let's go here to the list item. Let's add the ng4. Let's put here let task of tasks. And again, tasks is part of the task service object. So we'll leave it like such. We don't need this anymore. And if we remember, the task is an object that has parts inside of it. So we'll put here the print values, the interpolation for the task.title. And maybe we'll put a dash here. And just to visually see if it's completed or not, we'll put here task.completed. And don't forget, the completed key there is just a Boolean. But so we should be able to see first task, false, second task, false, etc. So let's test this. There it is, as expected. First task, false. Second task, false. Third task, false. Fourth task, false. Awesome. So let's go back here. Great. So since we're on the task list, let's modify this task a little bit since we're right here. Let's go ahead and add a button right here. And we'll give a button for each one of these list items that come up. So we'll put here a button. And the purpose of this button is going to be for us to change the status from completed to, from completed false to completed true. So this button here, we're going to give it an event of click. We're going to give it a name. We'll say here complete task or click to complete. How about that? Click to complete. We already know it's a task. So on this click event, let's set the value here to be some kind of function that we will write in our JavaScript code right over here. So since this is going to be used to complete a task, we'll call it complete task. We're going to invoke the function. And since between line 25 and line 28, we are going to have the task object available to us, we are just going to pass that object into that function right here. So I'll take this step by step for us. I'm going to go down here to the task list component. I'm going to create the function called complete task right here. And let's make sure we can actually invoke that. Make sure the function is working. Alert, working, save it, move over to our HTML. Clear that off for a second and refresh our page. And here's all of them. Here's the, of course, it's repeating of them. That's why we see them all. Let's click on it, and we can see it's working. And of course, if one is working, all of them should be working. We know that's working. Great. Oops. Let's move here to the right. And now we know that we're passing the task object inside of it. So in the completed task, we can expect the task object. And since we know the task object has parts inside of it, well, if we don't know, of course, we can console log it. Let's look at the task object here when we just console log it. Let's save it. Go back here. Expect. Console. Click on it, and there it is. There's a key of title and the key of completed false. So all we want to do is just change that completed false to true. We can toggle it, but being a task list, let's just keep it so that it just moves from false always to true, no matter how many times we click that button. We'll go back over here. This task object is the individual one we clicked on. All we need to do here is say tasks.completed, which is the key we're modifying. We're going to set that to true. That's it. I'm going to get rid of the console log. We're going to save this. We're going to move over to our page and test it. So click on this. There we go. We changed it to true. And this is nice because we can now even style these. So if we want it so that every time we click on these, we want this task to change color, perhaps, we can use now that task's key of completed and change its styling. So let's wrap this whole thing in span tag, a span tag, I should say. All right. And let's give this a class of completed, a CSS class of completed, as long as the task.completed evaluates to, well, let's see, if we want this to change, let's say when it's completed, we want this to be true. So, right, so if it's true, it's going to work, so it's going to give us that class. Awesome. Yep. Lost my train of thought there for just a minute. So let's give it the styles.
And as you're typing out your styles there, I'll let you keep typing. Obviously, you're not going to typically display a flag on the screen, but you know, when we're walking through the demo, and especially if you're doing development, sometimes it's just nice to see that, to know that everything is behaving the way that you expect.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So let's set this to be color. Let's see, what's color? Green, probably, right? Green is like a nice
green, sure.
We're going to go with green. Switch over. Let's see if that works. And there it is. And again, just like you said, we wouldn't want to see this, so perhaps we would change this. We would even just change the styling so we can put the, I don't know, like a line across it, or make it fade over time, all those kind of nice fancy things. There we are. Cool. So this is nice because we can look at our tasks, we can keep them on the page, we can even remove them, we can even delete them, which we'll do here in a second, but we can't really add tasks yet. So let's do that. Go back here. Now, the task list component is its own thing, and it's working great, and that's fine. Then this is the tasks main component we have, which we have inside of the task list. So why not just add the task new right above the task list? So let's go over here and add the tag preemptively, task new, right over the task list. This we need another component for, so I'm going to create one more of these green lines so we can separate them out visually. And here, we're going to create another component. This one is going to be called the task new component. So I'm using the same naming convention as the other ones. So this will say task, capital N for new, component. Here we are. Delete that there. And again, for this to work and the template to load into the tasks component, for the task new component to load in the task component. We also need to not only keep the tag there, but we need to make sure that this component expects that directive. So let's go to the directives array and add that task new component. And now it will look for that tag. And now here, it's going to replace it with whatever we have in the template. And again, I'm going to follow a little bit of the same pattern as we did the other one up there. I'm going to put an h4 tag. And another h4 tag, we'll put here task new, or create a task. How about that? We're going to be a little more formal. So let's take a look to see if that loaded. Left side here, and there it is. Create a task. So now the task component has inside of it two components. It has the create task component and the task list component. The task list component is retrieving data from the task service. So we want to make sure that the task create, or the task new component, when it creates something, it's grabbing, adding data to the same place as our task list is retrieving data. So we will really follow a very similar pattern we did with a task list. We'll follow the same pattern with a task new. So again, we talked earlier how we set the provider in our root component over here, the task service provider. So we don't need to worry about that anymore. All we need to do is make sure we use dependency injection to have that task service object available to us. So public task service, we'll use the same name, almost. There we go. Task service, there we are. And so now this is available to us. That's good. So this is a task new component. We want to add a component on there. So we'll create the good old form here. And we're going to add a new feature we haven't seen yet. We have seen the event for a on click event. We have seen the event for mouse enter event, and you can imagine mouse leave, and those work. There's also one for submit. So let's create the input here real quick first. We're going to use, again, the same thing here, the ng model. And we're going to store the ng model to be some kind of value. So what should that value be? Well, initially when this component starts, it's going to need to know what kind of object you want in here, right? So we need to initially start with some kind of model object there, and then we can modify the object as we're adding things to it. And then every time we create an object, we can redefine it to an empty object. So you'll see this here in a second.
That's kind of a stock standard pattern in a lot of MVVM frameworks, that you create that empty object and then you just reset it when you're done using it.
Yeah, exactly. So let's go here and say there is going to be a variable called tasks. We're not going to give it a type, although in TypeScript this would be a no-no. We would want it to give it a type, certainly. But again, I just want to show that we don't have to use TypeScript, so that doesn't have to necessarily happen. And then once this new task, the task new component is loaded, we want to set the tasks, I put here tasks, but it should be singular task. We want to set that to be an object that has a title key of empty string and a completed key of false by default. So what I'm doing here is really the same thing I did up here when I generated these, right? I'm generating one of these kind of as a default one. We should really create a class to have a constructor, and we could do that a little later, but I want to keep it as simple as possible just to visually see this. So as soon as this gets constructed, we'll have this task instance become an empty object. So in the ng model here, I need to specify task. And of course, it's an object, so we want to see what part of this task do we want them to edit here. Just the title. So assuming we had also description, we can include that as well in the next line, but we'll just leave it as is for now. And just to make sure it's working, we're going to use interpolation here and just print the task.title to see that is working. So switch over to the left side here. Every time I save, it reloads this, so there's a bunch of errors as I'm modifying things. So it looks bad. So let's put here testing. Testing is working. Awesome. I didn't set any event to it yet, so there's no reason to do that. Go back now, since we know that is working. And let's add a button. Type submit. And also in the form, let's give it an event. On submit, do something. And let's invoke a function over here. Let's give it the ability to run a function down over here. So we'll say on submit. So,
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, we are just making this up. We're saying when this form submits, as opposed to refreshing the page and going to a different page, those kind of things, it's going to be a AJAX call, as we would say. And well, specifically here, it's going to be an event that is just triggering this little block of code here. But of course, it could lead into an AJAX call later on in the service.
Yep. So I'll let you keep adding in the on submit, which is just going to have our stock standard functionality. The one thing I always like to point out about doing that type of submit event binding is what's nice about it is you can then just create the form just like you normally would, that you would just typically have some form of a submit button and away you go. So just makes it a little bit more natural.
Absolutely. Exactly. So on the submit function here, we're going to call directly into the task service. And we're going to push into it this task object that we have modified by perhaps typing stuff here. So we're going to say this dot task service, and there's kind of a roadblock here. Of course, we would want the task service to do all of the updating, deleting, editing. So in theory, what we should do here is just write a function called add and pass the task object into it. A more simple way to do it is push. And so we can push that into the array. And let's just test this real quick to make sure that's working. See, we got a little error here. Oh, do we have an error? Let's see. Refresh this. Let's try it again. Test. Oh, we do have an error, and it is refreshing. So let's take a look at this real quick. So task is not defined, and I think that is because initially when the component loads, that's the time we need to actually define the task to be that object. I did a mistake here. So let's do that here and not in the constructor and see if that changes things. Clear that. Test, submit. Let's take a look. So let's see, the task object here, we're trying to define it to this. The issue actually is right here, right? This task variable needs to be this instance of task, which is part of the task new component. So honestly, this wouldn't matter if we did it in the constructor or initially right here. I think it's cleaner if we do it in the constructor personally, but I don't know if it really makes a big difference for now.
It sort of makes more sense, I think, to put it in the constructor.
Awesome. Try this again. Clear all that red, refresh the page, test, submit, and one more mistake. Let's see what's going on here. Oh, push. Let's see, I'm thinking about different languages here. Task service dot push. What am I thinking? Pushing into an array in JavaScript.
Unshift.
Unshift, well, at the end. Not insert. What am I thinking here?
Yeah, push.
Push, right? Yeah. Oh, right. Absolutely. It is push, but we're trying to push into the task service, and that's not going to work because the task service is a big object. So we need to say this.taskservice.tasks .push.
There we go.
Sometimes I think of like insert, or sometimes I think of like
And you know, it's probably worthwhile mentioning that in a full application, that task service, we should probably just add on a method to handle that rather than pushing onto the array manually.
That's exactly right. Then we can actually do that as well. There we go. And now it's pushing onto it. So we can just change this. Notice how that stays as the variable test. And that is an issue here, because if I change that, it's changing the memory location. To avoid that little issue, every time we push into it, we redefine the task to equal to a new default task. So we're redefining the pointer, essentially. Save this. Test, submit, there it is. 1, 2, 3, submit, there it is. And as I change these, they change, of course, to green as I complete them. So, awesome. Let's clean this up just a little bit. Just like you mentioned, this should not be done here on the task new component. And the reason being is because it might be more than just a task new component that needs to add to the tasks. So for that, we want this logic to always happen in the task service. And we don't want to be the ones from a component meddling with the task service. So let's do that real quick. We're going to say this.taskService.addTask. And in this add task, we'll add this.task. And after this function executes, we'll redefine the task to be in a different task regardless. Now we have an add task function in the task service. I'm going to go way up to the task service. I'm going to set up a add task function. And in here, we expect a task object to the parameter. And now here we can say this.tasks.push the task object. And that should be it. Let's double check. Save that. Go back to our page here. Clear this. Refresh the page. And testing, submit, and there it is, testing right there. 1, 2, 3. There it is. As I click these, they'll turn green, of course. Awesome. And again, that is so that if we wanted from another component to use this function of that service, all we need is the service there, call the service function called add task, pass the task, and we let the service take care of all of the data, the meddling of the data, right? All the code in these classes should be strictly based off of manipulating and modifying the template itself, like passing data to the template, or retrieving data from the template, not necessarily manipulating the data. Awesome.
All right, well, I appreciate all of that because now we've seen the beginnings. Now we've seen how we could go in and display out a list, and we've also seen how we could programmatically add on. And then from there, it's just going to be a matter of adding on the next little component to do an edit, and then the next little component to do a delete. And it's very nice, that very cool little modular aspect that Angular is going to give to me, and that it really is just simply a matter now of taking everything that we've learned and applying it to flesh out this application.
Exactly.
I love it.